Hi, this is Garrett Van Every, and I'm doing my report on language development in deaf children. First thing I want to talk about is some misconceptions that people have about deaf people in general. One is the use of the term deaf. Some people think this is an offensive term. However, most deaf people refer to themselves using this word. Some people might say, use the word hearing impaired, but actually this would offend a lot of deaf people who don't really see themselves as being impaired or disabled. Um, and another category is hard of hearing, which is actually not deaf, but it is hearing loss that causes problems. So basically, we classify deaf. Um, there's a couple of ways to classify it: the amount of hearing loss, and by that definition, 90 decibels or greater, which is about the sound of a lawnmower, is classified as legally deaf. So another misconception is that deaf people can't hear anything, which most deaf people do have some form of residual hearing. And another big one, is that sign language is somehow universal between different countries, groups, but of course this isn't true. Most countries have their own sign language. Most notably, the United States has a different sign language than Britain, even though we share the same spoken language. So the educational definition of deaf, which is a little more useful than the physiological one, this comes from the IDEA Act 2004, which is the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. And they classify it as a hearing impairment that is so severe that the child is impaired in processing linguistic information through hearing with or without amplification. So basically, if they're using a hearing aid or if they're not, they still aren't able to process language auditorily. And the educational definition of hard of hearing is an impairment in hearing, whether permanent or fluctuating, that adversely affects a child's educational performance. This is a pretty broad definition. This could affect a lot of people. And so the prevalence, 0.13% of the school-age population is deaf or hard of hearing. Deaf is much more uncommon, more rare. So the estimates for deaf is 4 to 11 per 10,000 births. So it's very rare. There's not a high probability that as a teacher you're going to see a deaf kid in your class, but they are out there. And congenital hearing loss, 1 to 6 for every 1,000 births. So kids born with some sort of hearing impairment or hearing loss, degree of hearing loss, not necessarily deaf. And an important thing to understand about deaf people is that they have a very strong culture, and they do consider themselves a cultural group, a minority. They're linked by their language, by the use of sign language. A lot of deaf people end up going to deaf colleges and state schools. And like was said earlier, you really want to be careful when you call someone who's deaf disabled. And the reason is because they are able to use language. It's just not spoken language. It's sign language. So interestingly enough, a lot of deaf people intermarry with each other, and oftentimes they would rather have a deaf child so that they can be sort of linked in this culture they have. So the most important aspect of deaf culture, of course, is sign language, and it varies independently of spoken language, of course. A couple interesting examples are in Nicaragua. School kids in the 70s and 80s kind of spontaneously generated a new sign language, and a kind of similar thing happened in the Middle East with Bedouin groups, where there are high amounts of deaf people. They actually have their own kind of unique deaf languages. for sign languages. And sign language is recognized as a language because it has its own grammar, syntax, phonology, morphology, etc. And it's like for ASL, um, it's not like spoken English. It has its own unique grammar structure. And so in the United States, of course, we use ASL. And then in the classroom, they'll also use Signing Exact English, which is pretty unpopular with most deaf people. And it hasn't really worked out so well. The big push is for ASL. So with infants, sign language follows spoken language development patterns. So you'll see, typically, you see the speech milestones, 8, 9, 10 months. You'll also see those happen with deaf infants. In fact, a lot of times early on, they'll be able to create more signs than babies who are hearing babies who are speaking. So they actually have a larger vocabulary. And infants with deaf parents exhibit the most development. So infants who grow up with two hearing parents generally are behind in their vocabulary development. And less than 10% of deaf children have deaf parents. So as they become toddlers, by 24 months, the vocabulary of the average deaf child with deaf parents approximates that of the average hearing child. So like we said, it's really a benefit for deaf children to have deaf parents. It helps them tremendously because they're using sign language and developing those language skills inside their brain. And with deaf kids, the way their signs develop is they have a more linear curve. It doesn't change so much, whereas with hearing infants, you get a lot of spurts or sporadic times where they'll pick up a lot of words and then times where they won't. Deaf is a little bit more gradual. So that brings us to the subject of cochlear implants, which are it's a surgical procedure by which they bypass the inner ear and send electric impulses to the brain so that otherwise deaf people can hear. And the pros, they've done studies and they've shown that they do hit kids who get these implants do have higher achievement in reading and writing in the long run. If done early, the child can learn to speak normally. Of course, normally is all depends on your point of view, but they don't have as many problems. As you get older, it is harder for them. And it can help children have better relationships with their hearing parents or with the people around them who are not deaf. The cons: implants have not been shown to completely eliminate achievement gaps, although they've increased achievement. They still, generally speaking, they will still lag behind their peers. So what happens is they get these implants and then they get placed in mainstream classrooms and they don't get as much work with ASL. So what can happen is not only are they outsiders in the mainstream classroom because they're behind all their peers, but also they're not getting that instruction in ASL, which is really important to their identity as a deaf person or identifying with their deaf culture. So they get kind of stuck in this middle ground. So that's the last part there, is that it is a lot of deaf people are strongly opposed to cochlear implants because they think that it's interfering with the deaf culture and destroying the integrity of it. So for school-aged deaf children, by the time they graduate, the reading and writing achievement gap averages 5 years. So a deaf high schooler, will be reading at a 6th or 7th grade level by the time they graduate. And there is an achievement gap in all subjects, although in reading and writing it's the largest. And there are lots of deaf schools and universities. Of course, in Santa Fe, we've got the New Mexico School for the Deaf. And Gallaudet is probably the most famous, and that's in Washington, D.C. And now what most classrooms advocate is bilingualism, and that's where they're pushing for ASL as the first language and English as the second language. Deaf people are designing the curriculum, and it teaches about deaf culture. That's it.